Before we move on to Game 4 of the regular season, let's take a moment to explore some more behind-the-scenes stories. In particular, I'd like to shed some additional light on why Milwaukee became the Packers' second home away from Green Bay, and this information comes from Cliff Crystal, the team's official historian. In 1933, the Packers were deep in debt, and the unpaid bills led to judgments against them, thus causing the team to go into a receivership where assets could be sold to help pay off what they owed, and this in turn led to the team setting their sights on Milwaukee. Crystal elaborates. It was all about survival. On August 15, 1933, the Packers went into receivership, and Frank Jeunet, a Green Bay accountant, was appointed receiver of the Green Bay Football Corporation, the community property that had been running the Packers since 1923. Years later, Jeunet said when Judge Henry Grass named him receiver, he handed him $76.18 along with judgments and unpaid bills amounting to more than $15,000. Less than a month later, the Packers announced that they were moving their third home game of the season against the New York Giants to Milwaukee's Bushert Field. It's important to remember when this happened, the NFL was just 13 years old. Despite their recent championships, there was no storied history yet because everything was still so young. You could have been born before the Green Bay Packers existed and still be a teenager in 1933. The concept of lifelong Packers fans spreading the love of the team to multiple generations to guarantee survival simply didn't exist. Another factor was gate receipts. When the Packers weren't doing well, it wasn't just affecting them. Other NFL teams suffered financially too, as revenue from ticket sales were shared with a visiting team, so why would it be fair for a Chicago or New York franchise to take a pay cut for playing in Green Bay while the Packers would essentially receive a pay raise when the situation was reversed? They needed to have some games in a larger metropolitan area, or internal pressures would eventually rip them apart, and Milwaukee would provide them with what they needed, as seen in these 1930 U.S. Census results. This larger population would help to draw more fans. As a side note, in terms of stadiums and capacity, I wasn't able to find word on just how many seats the Old City Stadium in Green Bay had in 1933. However, the official Green Bay Packers website noted that by 1934, it could seat 15,000. Crystal continues. But it turned out to be a marriage made in heaven, to borrow an ageless idiom. If Milwaukee had not become a second home to the Packers from that date forward, they almost certainly wouldn't have survived. The Giants game drew 12,467 fans, the Packers' largest home crowd of the season, and was obviously a financial success, although the visiting team won 10-7. Other than the Bears game, which drew a similar-sized crowd to Old City Stadium, the attendance for the Packers' other 4 games in Green Bay that season were reported as 5,000, 5,200, 4,000, and 3,007. In terms of the timeline of how Lombardi got hired, I had already said in another video that Lombardi's account of how it went down matched up with the David Meredith's book, When Pride Still Mattered, and to this point, Crystal provides more details. First off, Lombardi was not the first choice. The Packers had evidently first pursued Iowa coach Forrest Evashevski, who had led his team to the top spot in the country in college football. Well, the top spot is chosen by the Football Writers Association of America. Other groups put the LSU team at number 1. Regardless of what poll you go by, it was a great season for Evashevski, and Green Bay had an interest in him. When he was hired by the Packers, Lombardi told the New York Times they had first approached him at the NFL draft meeting in Philadelphia, which ran from January 21st to 23rd, 1959. He also told the Times he traveled to Green Bay and settled on a contract on January 26th. By then, Iowa coach Forrest Evashevski had turned down the job. At least that was what he told me in a 2003 interview, or what Sid Hartman reported in the Minneapolis Morning Tribune back in 1959. Additionally, Jerry Burns, one of Evashevski's assistant coaches at Iowa and later an assistant with the Packers and head coach of the Vikings, told me that he and another assistant accompanied Evashevsky to Green Bay for his interview. Hartman reported back then that Evashevsky visited Green Bay before attending a banquet in Minneapolis on January 19th and declined the Packers' offer on January 23rd. So if this is accurate, Lombardi only got the job because another coach decided against it, although the reason for him doing so is unclear. While I previously heard claims Lombardi was not the first selection, it is interesting hearing it confirmed by Cliff Crystal, as he himself had spoken to Evashevsky. When Lombardi got to Green Bay, he had a lot on his docket, and this of course involved going over as much game footage for 1958 as possible to see who he would keep, and safety Bobby Dillon was of particular interest. Dillon actually lost his left eye when he was 10, following a series of accidents, but this didn't slow him down. Instead, not only was he able to make it to the professional level, by the time he retired, he had the second most interceptions in NFL history with 52. Well, he almost didn't play that final 1959 season. As I said in previous sections of this documentary, he wanted to hang it up, but to Lombardi, Dillon was one of the few players that was irreplaceable, and he was going to get him on his team any way he could. Dillon eventually gave in until Vince said he'd have to pay a $100 a day fine for the time he missed. Dillon recounted, "I said, 'Thanks, Jack,' and hung up. About 20 minutes later, Lombardi called. He said, 'I understand your position, but I have my rules.' I said, 'Fine, I'm just not going to do it.' He said, 'Wait a minute. You promise you'll keep it quiet. I'll give you a check for $4,500 or whatever it was. It'll be an expensive check, but you've got to sign it back to the team so I can say I fined you.' Everybody always said Lombardi never compromised, but I know one time he did. Dillon would end up with one interception for the season and would suffer a leg injury in the 8th game and would lose his job to John Seeming before retiring for good. Defensive tackle Dave Hanner, the same player mentioned that had collapsed during that 1959 training camp, was interviewed multiple times by Crystal in the 2000s, and here I'll include some of the more interesting parts. Hanner had come to the Packers in 1952 as a rookie, and on his experiences before Lombardi, Hanner said, "You wonder how anybody won games back in those days. You had one meeting a week. You looked at film on Monday or Tuesday, they put the game plan in on Wednesday, and you wouldn't meet again until the day before the game. You looked at one film, two at the most. The only time you had curfew was the night before the game. But the whole league was kind of like that, undisciplined. I guess Paul Brown was the most disciplined coach at the time. At least he had people wearing ties and trips and rules like that. Everybody else was loosey-goosey." When it came to former coach Scooter McLean, he said, "You go in on Monday to look at film, and half the time Scooter McLean would run the film and go to sleep. You had the big old reels at that time, and it would run all over the floor. The whole game would be on one reel, and it would be all over the floor. It was the mess you'd ever seen. He got too close to everybody. Somewhere you got to draw the line. He played cards with the guys." I seem to remember hearing that Coach McLean fell asleep during meetings, but I do not remember the source, and it's possible that it came from Hanner himself. What makes me doubt just how accurate this is would be that Jerry Kramer, Ray Nitschke, and Bart Starr all played under McLean, and none of them decided to mention this in any of their writings that I've seen. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. This could be a case of McLean briefly dozing off once or twice, which would still be unacceptable, but the line about how he fell asleep half the time comes across as exaggeration. And on why receiver Billy Houghton was let go, Hanner gave his own theory. "This is hearsay. My understanding is that he liked Houghton, but he brought Houghton in here and he told Lombardi what was wrong and what he needed to do. He was traded before he got home. Nobody was going to tell Lombardi what to do." Once again, I do not know how accurate this is, especially since Hanner himself admits it didn't come from any first-hand knowledge. Knaffel himself said he thought maybe it was Houghton not showing Vince the proper level of respect, so maybe what Hanner said was true, but again, this was hearsay. And with Hanner, we see another person confirm the story of Elenichek getting kicked out of a Lombardi meeting. His first night he had a meeting at St. Norbert. He had a few remarks about what he was going to ask everybody to do. Mr. Alanichek came in and sat down in the front row. Lombardi stopped and said, "Oh, do you want to see me?" He said, "No, sir." Lombardi pointed at the door and said, "You get your out of here and don't ever walk into another one of my meetings." He went around and chewed on about half the people in there and what he wanted when we hit the field, and he didn't let up. A lot of them said, "I can't believe this." And on that first training camp, Henner understandably didn't mention himself collapsing or needing to go to the hospital. However, he did summarize the overall intensity of those drills. "Darn, he near killed us. Run and run and run, up and down, up and down. You know how when you have 2-a-day practices, at the end of the first practice, you sit around and shoot the bull? Heck, everybody went to bed and slept until the bus was ready to go back. He got your attention." One of the most famous sideline moments in Lombardi's career is this video clip. This can create the impression that Lombardi is very vocal on the sidelines during games. However, Henner counters this. He'd yell down to Phil sometimes, "Phil, what the hell is going on down there?" But no, he didn't say much. And here we have Henner bringing up his salary. In 1953 and 54, I made $5,500. After 13 years, I was making $17,500. Henry Jordan and I were making the same at the time. Lombardi wasn't the easiest guy to get money from. He didn't want anybody happy. Henner's last year was in 1964, which was the 5th season of the rival American Football League's existence, so presumably at least part of the reason for the big jump was due to this. Moving on. Center Jim Ringo was smaller for his position, however he was able to succeed partially due to his quickness and defenses transitioning from 5-man lines to 4. He almost didn't make it though. When he first arrived in the NFL in 1953, he was only around 208 pounds and he grew frustrated at how things were going, so he left training camp for 5 days. He returned, however, and he was able to get back on track, but it's interesting to think what would have happened if Lombardi had been on the team then. Would he have been willing to welcome a player back that had been AWOL from camp that long? There's a famous story of Lombardi talking Giants player Sam Huff from leaving, but Huff came back the same day. Would Lombardi have done things differently if 5 whole days had passed? There is no definitive answer, but it's interesting to think about how things could have gone. Regardless, times were tough for Ringo prior to 1959. His own daughter was hassled by fellow students over the Packers' losing record. This in part led him to sending her back home to Pennsylvania, and he himself received a harassing phone call in the middle of the night where someone told him, "If you can't play, why stay?" As I said earlier in the documentary, this was still during the age where anyone could just look up an NFL player in the phone book. According to my research, having an unlisted number wasn't a possibility in the US until the early 1970s. So following all of this, when Lombardi finally arrived, Ringo supposedly asked to be traded, and Lombardi responded, "This is going to be a winning team." Ringo said he heard this line before, and Lombardi answered, "If it costs you your job, we're going to have a winner here." Ringo left impressed. Receiver Max McGee was mostly used as a running back in college. However, the Packers moved him to left end when he was drafted in 1954. He had a solid rookie season, but commitment to the Air Force caused him to miss 2 years. When he came back in 1957, it was unclear just how he was going to do, but Gary Knaffel suffered a knee injury, leaving room for McGee to get even more playing time. Speaking of Knaffel, Lombardi, as noted earlier, moved him to the right end position. He would be the starter before Ron Kramer eventually supplanted him. On the subject of Knaffel, Lombardi said, "While he doesn't have Ron's ball strength in blocking, going for that ball or running with it, he has great hands, has made some sensational catches in his 8 years with his club." As an interesting fact, Gary Knaffel appeared in the 1963 Hollywood movie Palm Springs Weekend under the pseudonym Gary Kincaid. So the Green Bay Packers were now 3-0, and we're going to take on the 1-2 Los Angeles Rams at home. Despite the injuries to the running backs, they had to have been feeling optimistic. Little did they know they were about to enter one of the darkest periods of Lombardi's entire career. So let's get back to the newspaper accounts. October 19th, 1959. The previous day, the Rams stunned the undefeated Packers, taking them out 45-6 in front of a crowd of 36,174 in Milwaukee County Stadium. Despite the final score, the match actually started off looking like it might be a defensive battle. Rams defensive end Sam Williams broke through the line on a Packers punt, blocking the kick attempt, thus leading to the game's first 2 points. Then, still in the first, the Rams' drive stalled, so they settled for a 22-yard field goal by Jack Morris. Bobby Dillon and Del Schaffner then battled over a contested throw. With their hands both on the ball, Schaffner was able to tear away from Dillon and get the score from 26 yards out. However, in the second, the Packers battled back and put up their first points, courtesy of a Horning kick. The Rams expanded the Packer deficit with another kick by Morris from 17, and finally Horning nailed a 46-yarder to make it 14-6. The only score of the third came when Rams runner Ollie Matson broke away for a 49-yard scamper. And it was in the fourth quarter that the defense finally crumbled. Marconi rushed from 1 yard out to make it 28-6. The Packers got the ball back and took it to the 1 yard line. However, they failed to score in what was their last real shot to stay in the game. Rams QB Billy Wade then hit Red Phillips for a 53-yard strike. Schaffner then got his second touchdown catch, this time on a 25-yard reception. And finally, to finish off the scoring, Morris got another kick in from 33 yards. It was a surprising and embarrassing performance. And here we can see some photos of the match, including one on the right, where it shows Lombardi walking away with his head down. The post-mortem stats, while bad, weren't as terrible as they could be, at least on offense, with McCann compiling these numbers. 13 out of 22 for 148 yards, no touchdowns, and an interception. Horning, again, had to put in work in place of Jimmy Taylor, who was still out with an injury. In this row, he put up 13 carries for 54 yards. He only had 13 attempts, but he did also catch 5 passes for 58 additional yards. For the receiving game, the only one that had a decent performance besides Horning was Gary Knathel with 3 catches for 40 yards. After the game, McCann gave his thoughts. Everything we did was wrong. All we can do is try to come back. McCann said the Rams' pass rush wasn't too bad. This made too many mental mistakes. I didn't think we'd get beat like that. Horning said, I got a rib cracked and my neck jammed, but I can't complain. I feel a lot better than I did last week about the injuries. We played a real bad ball game, couldn't do anything right. They got us in a hole and we couldn't get out. But we'll come back. We'd better. Bobby Dillon remembered that failed first quarter interception attempt against Rams receiver Del Schaffner. We were both going for it and he took it away from me. I had my hands on the ball, but he took it. Lombardi brought up the failed touchdown attempt from the 1 yard line. If we had scored, then the score would have been 28-13. And not only would have kept us in there, but would have given us a little fire, which we needed. We also stopped ourselves a lot of times with offsides and other penalties. They had us in a hole in the first quarter and we couldn't get out. But we got no excuses, we just got beat. One thing though, which I don't think is an alibi, we played the game with 2 backs, Horning and Carpenter. McElhaney has a bad shoulder and wasn't even available for kickoff returns. Lombardi was confident they could bounce back though, and when he was asked if he was bothered by the lopsided score, he said, No, it makes no difference when you lose, 1 point or 100. I would counter that while final scores can often be misleading, a larger loss can mean more adjustments needing to be made for the next game. But that being said, there were a few takeaways from this day showing reasons for optimism for the future. For one, the halftime score was only 14-6, and again, that Rams touchdown could have easily been an interception. While the Rams' passing and rushing game did excel, the dam didn't burst until the fourth, where the Packers' D gave up 24 points. When an opposing offense is able to do whatever they want in the first half, and they only score 14 points, that's something a coach can work with in the future. Also, when you see someone lose 45-6, you might automatically assume the quarterback played horribly, but as mentioned earlier, when McCann did have a bad game, it was not a terrible one. He still completed over 50% of his passes, and he had only 1 interception. And Paul Horning and Luke Carpenter's averages were both over 4 yards per rush. For as bad as this loss was, this was a situation that could be salvaged. October 20th. Lombardi discussed the urgency and wanted to get Jimmy Taylor back into the field, stating that he wouldn't be out of the hospital until Thursday, and it was doubtful he would play the next game against the Colts. On the night of October 6th, Taylor suffered the oil burn injury. Since then, he had spent most of his time recuperating at the hospital due to an earlier infection risk, which evidently complicated the recovery timeline. October 21st. The paper previewed the upcoming Baltimore Colts game. The Colts, of course, were a squad that Lombardi had faced as an assistant coach in the 1958 NFL Championship game just the year before, and now he was getting an opportunity to potentially avenge this earlier loss. Left guard Fussy Thurston was a member of Baltimore before being traded to Green Bay, and on this issue he said, "It's always nice to play against somebody you know real well, and it will be a big thrill to play against the Colts. We have a good chance to beat them if we play the game we're capable of playing." On a rather odd note, despite there being just 12 teams in the league and 12 regular season games, quarterback Lamar McCann had never played the Colts before during the regular season. And this was in his 6th year in the league, with his first 5 being with the Chicago Cardinals. Let me repeat. There were only 12 teams in the league, and McCann in 5 years hadn't played the Colts during the regular season even once. So how was that possible? Contrary to some assumptions, before the 1960s, despite the league's small size, there were no rules in place to guarantee that each NFL team would play everybody else at least once a year. In fact, when it came to teams outside your division, there were no rules at all. For example, in that same 1959 season, the Packers were scheduled to play a regular season game against the Washington Redskins on November 22nd. After that, they wouldn't meet again in the regular season until November 24th, 1968. 9 years passed because there were no rules that mandated they absolutely had to play one another. And further down in the article, we can see the Colts were 13-point favorites over Green Bay. Part of this was due to their last game in 1958, where the Colts beat them 56-0. Baltimore was known for its passing attack, and with Johnny Unitas, who was regarded as the best quarterback in the NFL, it seemed likely he would have an even better game than the Rams did. October 23rd. Lombardi remained optimistic, noting that the team was the healthiest it had been since their match against Detroit, although Jimmy Taylor would still be out of action. His hand had healed, however, he still had to deal with his foot. October 24th. The article noted that the Packers and Colts were both tied for the number 1 spot in the Western Division with 3-1 records, and this match would determine if the Packers were for real. Green Bay had an opportunity to bounce back from their embarrassment to the Los Angeles Rams, but unfortunately, things were about to get even worse. That's all for now. When we continue, we'll go deeper into the Packers slide, where Lombardi was going to be tested more than he had ever been before. See you next time.